All you, Jason.
All right. As Ms. Denis has told you, I am Jason Buck. I teach at Century High School. One thing that she didn't mention, and it's just kind of a me thing, if you are able to have your cameras on, I would love that. I have the fear of 2020 all over again every time I'm in a room with a bunch of blank screens. So it helps us sort of figure out like if you are understanding what we're talking about. And so if you're willing, I'd love that. All right. So this is our unit essential question. It's basically about climate change and climate's impact. It's sort of a retouching of unit one. Unit one is on biodiversity. And so it kind of comes back full circle, sort of like a book with, a cover on both ends. Our anchoring phenomenon is climate change has and will continue to alter Earth's ecosystems, including forests of the Pacific Northwest. If you haven't figured it out already, every unit that we do is very Oregon based. And so this one is as well. This is our roadmap through. As Charlotte already mentioned, it is a short unit. I have a hard time getting through all of it. And so you can see it starts with climate change and it ends with forest management. 6.4 and 6.5 are sort of similar to each other. They just kind of hit on two different points. And so you can see carbon cycle and geological history in there as well. Geological history is of Oregon. Again, that connection. This is one of our first design principles that we're going to kind of talk about. We're going to be doing differentiation in this particular unit, also inquiry and cultural responsive. I find that cultural responsive is the most difficult, especially for a new teacher. So it's very nice that that's all incorporated in here. You're also going to see a couple of units or a couple of shared history pieces that we have added to this particular unit. I think there's 5 total. Charlotte, is that correct? In the entire year?
So what Jason's referring to is the tribal history, shared history lessons, which were written in conjunction between ODE and the federally recognized tribes of Oregon. And as high school science teachers, there are actually 4 units that all high schools should be implementing in their science curricula. And in patterns, the bulk of those fall within the biology course just because the lessons that were written with the tribes and ODE match the best with the biology content. So in biology, we have 3 lessons, 3 of the 4. There's one that is taught about seasonal rounds in unit 1. And then there is another one in unit 4. And then this unit 6 has the last one, which is about tribal partnerships. So public and tribal partnerships, or I guess partnerships with tribes and other entities. And so that is in this unit. The last one, the 4th one, has been incorporated into the chemistry unit, or into chemistry unit 4. So if your chemistry colleagues are teaching, or maybe some of you are teaching patterns chemistry, then you've probably seen those tribal history, shared history materials. I think it's in unit 4 of chemistry.
Yeah, there's just 2 of 6.4 and 6.5 seem to have, I think it's kind of branches the 2 of them is where that unit or that piece hooks up. All right. These are our targets for unit 6. And so you can kind of see them. I'm not going to read them to you. You can kind of see where they all are. Quite a few things are being covered in this particular unit. I know that a lot of schools are being asked to do course outcomes and other things for standardization. And so I'm pretty familiar with where these things line up and how they sort of hook in.
One thing I think that's important to note here is that the pattern sequence is not set up with a separate Earth and Space Science course, because many schools in Oregon that are following patterns are doing the 3 required years in physics, chemistry, and biology. And so because of that, all of the Earth and Space Science standards at the high school level have been split up. So many of them go into the physics course, a few into chemistry, and then this unit and unit 1 in biology also have a fair number of ESS standards. So that's why you're going to see, you see them here at the end. This last 4 are all ESS. But we'll point out a little bit later that there's actually a fair bit of overlap between some of the life science standards and the earth science standards. And so they kind of really dovetail very well together, easy to get 2 for 1.
All right, so this is the first piece of the unit. It's 6.1. It's like the rest of our units, we start with some sort of phenomenon. And then in this particular case, we're talking about climate change has a significant effect across the biosphere and geosphere. And one of the phenomena that we've chosen to pick is fires. So besides COVID, we probably remember in 2020, there were also fires. There was that time where not only could you not go to a restaurant or anywhere with masks, even then, you couldn't even go outside because there were fires so badly that you basically couldn't go outside without health risk. And so this is the phenomenon that we chose. Most of our students remember this happening, so it's something that you can kind of point to. And so before this, I didn't even know that 2020 was the worst year ever, but after seeing all of this stuff, it's very interesting. And so you can see the main piece there is that HSESS22. And so it's how climate change is affecting wildfires in the Western states.
I actually just even heard on the radio, just driving home right after school today, that there has been a new report talking about air quality, the number of days of poor air quality. And the trend is, none of us is surprised to know that the trend is increasing. And so I'm actually really interested when we're finished here. I'm going to look up the data and see if we can figure out some kind of graphing task to do that will, indicate how, give students a visual about how that's impacting them. They might see this graph that we're looking at here to see that, yes, 2020 was the most active fire year, but our students today I teach juniors, right? They were in 5th grade when this happened, or 6th grade. So that might not be as fresh in their mind, might not have been as impactful, perhaps, as it was even for us as adults. So I'm going to see if I can figure out some of those new data that have just come out about trends in air quality data.
Yeah, I just know that I've gone to Bend the last 2 summers for vacation, and both times we had to stay inside for at least a day because it was so smoky. So even with the time passing, there's still many days of poor air quality because of the fires. So this is, you can kind of see here on the right, these are some of the maps that the students are going to look at and some of the visualizations. There are graphs, there are other data sources that the kids are going to use. It kind of reminds me of what we do in Unit 4, where each group of kids is looking at maps and trying to figure out and deduce what they notice about those maps. And then we have a full-on discussion about how these things are impacted. And so if you click on that maps, graphs, and images of impacts of climate change, you will notice that these maps are all there. So in my room for Unit 4 and for this unit, I will print these large so that the students can actually hold them in their hand. It also gets them a chance to get off the computer. We spend a lot of time on those computers. And so looking at the maps, obviously they can't look at this one because this one is moving, but most of them are not that way. So that's kind of how they start. And you asked for, at least in the last webinar, they asked for the time. So this is about a 90-minute thing. So it will take about one period at, we're on block, so we have about 90-minute periods. So 2 days and 45s.
Sometimes I get asked about the interactive notebook. I don't know how many of you have looked at it or have used it on the different units. There are some people have built slides-based interactive notebooks. I have a colleague who uses a paper notebook, a very kind of more traditional way, uses similar kinds of prompts to what I have in the electronic version. I personally like to have the interactive notebook in electronic version because then the students can't tell me that they lost it or that that they don't have it that day. As long as they have access to a device, then they have access to their interactive notebook. So I choose not to use the slides one. There are some advantages to using that. I have just stuck with the docs one. I'm not super visually creative, so I like the predictability of the docs version. But the disadvantage is that I have to kind of know what I'm doing for the whole unit before I put it out to them. Now, sometimes I do make a change and then I just have this, might give them a link to the original and have them cut and paste if I've made a modification, or I have them make a change in their interactive notebook if I've made a change to the lesson. So some people like to do it as individual things. Some people like to do it on paper. Brianna, thank you very much for that comment. I appreciate it. I mean, I do think that this is not a course where we're picking up, in standards-based grading, we're not necessarily picking up every single piece of student work for a grade, right? And so I like to have it so that I can just do a very quick check-in. I have all of them in one folder in my Google Drive. I can open them up. I can just even scan through and say, did you do something today? And then give in Beaverton, we have separate behavior grades. So I can give a behavior grade for participation in that day, or whether they worked in their group effectively. And I really like to have access to that at any time and not have to flip a lot of pages. But if you can also accomplish the same task with a paper notebook or a slides version. So this is kind of where I was going a little bit earlier, an example of how one of the life science and earth space science standards are really complementary to each other. You have develop a model to illustrate the role of photosynthesis and respiration in the cycling of carbon. And then in the ESS standard, you have develop a model to describe the cycling of carbon. So, all of the different spheres of the earth are referenced in both. And the life science one just has a little additional detail of specifically calling out photosynthesis and respiration. So you'll see as we go through this next task set, the task set 6.2 has a bunch of different kinds of things in it. And we probably could break it up into 6.2, 6.3, 6.4, because there are several things going on, but they're all related to the carbon cycle, which is called out in both of these standards. So our phenomenon in this task has to do with carbon, of course, and how changes in human practice have to happen in order to prevent significant damage due to climate change. Now, I've been doing this job for a while. This is my 20th year as a teacher. And so some of you may remember, if you're my age, watching film strips or films that came from the Annenberg Center for Educational Progress or something like that. But they shifted their focus to and rebranded themselves Annenberg Learner a while ago. And the task that we have students do to interact first around the idea of the carbon cycle is an old simulator, and it does have its quirks, and I'll point some of those out a little bit later, but that's what you're seeing. Jason is a expert at making these animated images. And so what you're seeing here on your screen is how the simulator changes over time. And I'm going to point out a couple of things about that. I think you have the same one on this next slide. So what do students do in this task? Well, you have access, you can see the student template and the slides that we recommend you show while students are doing this task. I also added an example of student work. That's something else that people were asking for after the last couple of webinars. So we tried to provide more examples of student work. So if I messed up on the permissions on that, sorry. I think I got it right. But in this task, what students do is that they identify, learn about, well, what are carbon sinks and what are carbon sources, the difference between those two terms. And then they make some predictions about changes to those sinks over time. So in this, I'm actually just going to zoom down what I'm sharing to you so you can see it a little bit better. So what you have here is Not a very up-to-date, like not a beautiful image that one might expect to see from today's level of graphics technology, but it works. So we have the different spheres represented over here. You have the biosphere and the geosphere, the hydrosphere and the atmosphere. And each one of those little gray boxes represents a gigaton of carbon, or excuse me, 25 gigatons of carbon. And as students make two shifts, they can change two things. They can change either the fossil fuel use, and they can, with this slider here, they can either increase it by a certain percent annually, or if they drag it all the way to the left, they can actually have negative increase. So they can have decrease in annual fossil fuel use year over year. And then the bottom one that they have is the net deforestation rate. And again, that can be positive in gigatons or negative in gigatons, which would imply reforestation as opposed to deforestation. And so as they click through and run the simulator, and it goes by decade, the gigatons of carbon move around in the simulator. And so you can kind of see in this animated image that Jason has made how different kinds of shifts can occur in the positioning of carbon in the different spheres. So this 100% directly connects to the standards that I just showed you, right? It says something like construct a model. They're not here constructing the model, but they're observing the model, and they are making changes, and the changes that they are making are causing the modifications in the positioning of the carbon. Now, in addition to that, they're also able to see here a graph that graphs years. It's a little hard to see, but years down on the x-axis, and parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And you can see how then, or the students can see how the changes that they have predicted, or the changes that they have set, I should say, in fossil fuel use and in deforestation have an impact on the atmospheric CO2. And this orange line represents the goal limit. And here's where the age of this simulator kind of rears its ugly head, is that this goal limit that's marked is pre-Paris. So I think this one is set at like 450 parts per million. And of course, after the Paris Accords, that goal limit was dropped, I think, to 350 or 375. I can't remember. But we do have students in the task. If you look at the student template, students have to kind of grapple with that and think, well, if I'm trying to get my simulation here to stay under this goal limit, and then later on in the lesson, we spring on them, well, that goal limit isn't actually the current goal limit. We actually have to keep it lower than that. And so they have they can see, and they do come out with in the simulator, it's very clearly obvious to them that just modifying the forestation rates, like bringing reforestation all the way as far as positive as it can go, isn't enough. There must be changes in fossil fuel usage according to this model in order for the goal limit to even possibly be reached. So we're teaching some of the history about the goal limit. There is a section in this task about where the CO2 measurements are taken. So there's information in there about the Mauna Loa Observatory and the Keeling curve. And so that's what they're really modeling here, is the Keeling curve. So hoping that things will stay underneath that goal limit, and then even trying for them to figure out how they might keep it under the actual current goal limit, which is not the one that happens to be shown on this image. So this takes, I'm going to expand my share back out here. This takes about another class period. So I like to call these one and done lessons, right? They don't tend to, oh, that's a good question, Caitlin. I'll be with that in just a second. This lesson is a good one to fit into one block. Now you're right, Caitlin. So Caitlin asked, if you're not seeing the chat, Caitlin asked, why does the peak come back down? And that happens when there are no more fossil fuels to burn. So when the model burns all the fossil fuels up to a certain point, only when there's no more coal. You can see, I can't pause this thing, but I'll see if I can point out when it gets there on this next round. So coal's going down less and less and less. And then now there's no more coal left. And that's when the CO2 goes down, because presumably photosynthesis is sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere at that point, but there are no more emissions due to coal. Okay. Any questions about that? This, when we look at the student, we can take a quick look at the student template. Bring this over here. So there are a couple of items. So they do the initial, there's some background information, talks to them about some of the history, the link to the simulator. This is a nicer picture. And then it gives them some details about what the setup is. And then they go, and we like to provide sentence frames all the time, right? To make sure that all of our students, not only English learners, but even students who have grown up with English their whole life, I find that providing sentence frames causes me to get many, many fewer answers that say IDK. So that's why we do that. I always tell the students that the frames, if they don't like the frames, they can delete them and start their own sentence. But more often than not, the students are at least getting started using the frames, and then maybe they go back and make some modifications. So, so you can kind of see it's there's a fair bit of reading here. And when I always have my students working in pairs or groups for something like this. For this one, it works, I think, quite well in a pair, because they can have one person running the simulator and the other person kind of reading the instructions out loud. And then they can both pause to write their answers to the questions. And I did put an example of student work here from last year. So if you're interested in seeing that, I have left that for you. Any questions so far? Or any other questions? Caitlin asked a good one. Okay. So once students have a pretty good idea of what's going on with the movement of carbon throughout the different spheres I like to have them read an article that has a connection specifically to forests, because so much of Unit 1 in when we talk about biodiversity or learn about biodiversity and the importance of biodiversity is focused on the predominant biome that we have in Northwest Oregon. And so there is this is an article called Forests as Carbon Sinks, and it talks about how essential the forests are as part of the carbon cycle as absorbers of carbon dioxide. And it impacts students to think through how I mean, we kind of prime the pump a little bit and think about how fires, when they destroy forests, are so impactful, because not only do they destroy the sink capabilities, but they also are huge emitters, right? Because all the carbon that's been stored in all those trees is released kind of really, really, well, not kind of, really, really quickly. So there is formative, questions informative, but you could do any kind of teacher choice reflection. I usually don't do the questions informative. I have them do some pair sharing, and then we hear ideas from across the room. The slides have the questions that are in the formative, so you can do it in any other format that you like. But I think that we have at my school, we have a rotating period where the students come through and I see them an additional 45 minutes once every 10 days or so. And this is a task that I usually do in that extra period. sometimes if the timing is right and I'm doing state testing around this time, this is an article that I would give them when some students have finished state testing. One thing I know that we would like to try and do, because I don't think that this article has an audio version, is to get one of us to read the article out loud, and so that kids who want to hear it in audio form will have access to that. But that's a long-term goal, have all of our articles having audio versions. Now, of course, the way that we learn science is extremely different from the way that our students are learning science, right? So for us, it was very, unidirectional from the teacher to the student, and the content was the only thing that was really delivered. Maybe from time to time you had a teacher who might be assessing your skills. But of course, the NGSS requires us to assess some skills. It says develop a model or come to a conclusion or analyze data related to. So we're required as teachers to provide these opportunities for students to interact and to work on skills. So we know that that's best, right? So we have hard skills and soft skills. We have this, rotation of ideas from teacher to student, teacher to student over here. And then the teacher and the student are having to interact with the content, and the teacher's responsibility is to try and weave all of that together. And it's much easier. I'm pretty lucky to have been able to teach all 3 patterns courses. I've been teaching chemistry for the last couple of years alongside biology. And I feel that that really helps me to be a better, more effective teacher of biology, because I have a better idea of where they've come, what content they're coming to me with, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And we tune the environment, right? And that's one of the things that's great about patterns. Of course, it's written for Northwest Oregon because the council and the support is coming from that part of the state. But we know that there are people out in other parts of the state who are working on making adaptations to this curriculum to really fit their students' needs and to make phenomena that are local to use. And we'll talk a little bit more about cultural responsiveness and being place-based a little bit later. So because we know and we have to fine-tune the environment, that's where differentiation comes in. So I just wanted to share a couple of things about how I think the patterns curriculum as a whole does that, and a couple of things that I do in my classroom that help to make differentiation not such a daunting task. So in the patterns curriculum, most of the tasks that we have that the council has written and revised, the goal is to have what we call multiple entry points. And this means that there are always different sort of levels of questions, but they're never really identified as different levels. So I think that there are different entry points, and I also think of them as different exit points, because students at different levels of proficiency are going to be able to show and complete different components of the work. And it's not a question of whether they got everything right, like a percentage type of grading system, but did they go in at the most basic level and come out at the mid-level proficiency? Or maybe did they go in at the basic level and come out at the mastery level, right? So there are opportunities in these tasks to measure growth. There are opportunities in these tasks for some students who might not need to go in at the most basic level. They might be able to jump in at a higher level of proficiency. We don't identify those entry points for students, right? We want the students to be able to kind of grasp all of or as much content as they can. But you as teachers are probably looking at these materials and noticing that the complexity is not the same, right, in all the levels of questions. And so depending on what kind of system you're using for grading and reporting and assessing, I encourage you to take the levels of complexity of the questions into account. Okay, so I was just checking the chat. We also want to try and have students do science. Now we're making some efforts in the second semester materials for there to be more doing of science. First semester has more of that right now, but if you were with Jason and Scott at at the Unit 5 webinar, you know that we've been working on a antibiotic resistance task, and I'm going to share with you a little bit later about a wet lab that you can incorporate into this unit. So that's always good, and it gets students more interactive and able to participate more. And then talking a little bit more about earlier on when I was mentioning the INB and also talking about writing sentence frames into every task, the expectation is that all students are participating, whether they're all participating in the writing if it's a writing task, or that the expectation is there that they're all participating in the talking if it's a talking task. Everyone has progress to make. And so I wanted to point out a strategy that I use in my classroom about grouping. And that's what I'm trying to show in this picture. So at the beginning of the year, I get my list, and by this time of the year, I certainly know the students relatively well. And in my diagram here, L and M and H are with respect to, it could be about reading level, it could be about writing level, it could be about just general English proficiency. And I sit my students at groups of 4, and I never, ever put a student talking for talking purposes. Sometimes they're talking across the table, which would, in my diagram here, I'm trying to represent that by the blue arrows, talking across the table. And then sometimes they're talking to their shoulder partner, and that I am trying to represent with the red arrows. And so I am very strategic about not only which group the students are sitting at, but which seat they're sitting at, because I want to make sure that students are always going to have a talking interaction with someone who is within one level. And again, this is my 3 levels, low, medium, and high, of communication skills of themselves. So I don't ever have students who might have a lowest level talking with a student who is at perhaps a highest level. And notice that I put those 2 students at diagonal corners of the table, so that whenever there's a talking or a writing opportunity for sharing, then they're always working with someone who is within one level of themselves. And so no one's feeling like anyone's having to pull the whole group, and no one's feeling like they're being completely left in the dust. So that's a way that I am able to differentiate, provide the same prompt to the whole classroom, but I know kind of where students are located, and I know what I'm listening for, keeping in the back of my mind what their levels of proficiency are. So it's a strategic way of setting up groups in the classroom. So one way that I do with differentiation. Okay, Jason, I'm going to let you take over on this part, unless there are other questions. Sorry, I didn't ask further questions.
Okay. So this is still part of 6.2, and I think we're going to get into that lab that Charlotte was just talking about in a second. But this is using a model to illustrate how photosynthesis transforms light into stored chemical energy. This is one of the things that sort of disappeared from biology and kind of moved to AP Bio. So I was glad to see it came back, and it comes back here. So most kids know that, you water your plants and sunshine has something to do with it. Beyond that, they don't really understand sort of the chemical processes that are involved. And so there are a couple of things that we do here, one of which is a virtual photosynthesis inquiry. And then, as Charlotte mentioned, we're trying to put in as many, wet labs as possible. So there is one with leaf discs that we're going to put in here in just a second. I totally agree. Charlotte has mentioned that before, where she goes through her groupings, and I'm like, that's amazing. I Do not
Should I
do that.
say, should I say on the recording that I spend more, I mean, the fact that I spend time like that on my seating charts, my grading drops off the planet sometimes.
Yeah.
But I think that I like to feel that I'm doing my best, putting most of my effort towards what's happening in my classroom.
Yeah.
Right. And to make sure that the student experience is positive. And so that's really important for me.
Yeah, I'm a huge nerd, and one of the things I did the other day was I created a spreadsheet that shows exactly how much time we spend doing each thing that we do. And I totally knew in my head that it was going to be more than 8 hours, right? It turned into 22. So 22 hours for all of the mandates that we've been given over the last, I've been teaching for 24 years. So, and no mandates ever disappear. They just add them. All right, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is the lab that Charlotte was mentioning. This is the floating leaf disc lab. And so what you're looking for here is how many of the leaves, the discs, float in about 15 minutes worth of time. So what you'll notice here on the graph to the right is that after 15 minutes, all 10 of those discs have floated to the top. And they're floating to the top because they are releasing oxygen gas, and that oxygen gas is moving them up the chain. And so they will float to the top. Obviously, at the very beginning, when they're first exposed to the light, they are not floating. They are just sitting there at the bottom. Pretty simple lab to do, very cheap. You just need a hole puncher and some leaves, and it works pretty well to kind of get this kind of going. This is something I've done in AP a couple of times. And so it's a pretty neat lab to see in regular bio.
So we actually,
Yeah,
as
go ahead.
Jason mentioned, there are two versions, right? So we historically, well, I guess around, around COVID, well, before, some of you have been around for a while. And so you may remember when we had algae in this unit, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But around COVID times, it wasn't possible for kids to grow algae. And so we came up with this virtual option where students are actually, I'm going to go back a step, through open processing, they are able to use a code that was written by Jason Galbraith, who is a computer science teacher at Sunset High School in Beaverton. He wrote code that actually shows a piece of Elodea and like virtual bubbles like coming up out of the Elodea. Now there's some constraints with that virtual option, and once we got back into the classroom, I really wanted to try and get another wet lab opportunity. And so I had done floating leaf discs early in my career, well before NGSS. And so it took us a few years to kind of take the virtual lab that we had written in the patterns inquiry, using the patterns inquiry processes, to get that converted over for the floating leaf discs. It's a pretty, I'm going to say it's a finicky procedure. The kids have to be real careful about not squishing the leaves. And so I would encourage you, if you're not familiar with this lab, to actually try it yourself first. But this is what I'm providing to you here is like links to a sneak peek. I did drop those folders or those documents into the actual live patterns biology open access folder, both the student template, what students will be doing, and then also the class data sheet. This has been a real revelation to me. My chemistry team at school started doing this last year, and I'm just going to open this up so you can see. This has been a game changer for me about collecting data. This is just one tab. I might have a tab. Let me just make this a little bit bigger so everybody can see. Down at the bottom, what I have for you here is just the template spreadsheet, but I copy this template for every class. And so I would have like Denis period 1 and Denis period 3 and Denis period 6. Not only does this reduce the number of files in my drive, because I have one spreadsheet per year instead of 4 or 5 spreadsheets per year, depending on the number of sections that I have. But in addition to that, I have all the student data right on my screen so that I can see if something has gone awry with their data collection, right? I know what I'm expecting them to get. If they increase the, nice, I increase if I see them increasing the light intensity and yet they're getting the same number of leaf discs that are rising, then clearly something else is going on. And that's a signal to me that I need to go and talk to that group and find out, are you actually turning the light up? Did you use a different light bulb? Did you bring your lamp closer? Did you bring your lamp closer to your cup of leaf discs? So this has been a game changer for me as in terms of making sure that everybody, well, being better, let's say, I don't know about making sure, being better about getting a larger fraction of my student groups to have data that they can actually analyze. So this is helpful. We also, I've kind of moved away from having students calculate all the averages on their own. I have chosen to move towards letting them observe how Excel can do that work for you. Right? So here, for example, this is already set. Oh, you can't see that. Whoops. Drag this up here. In the columns for average, it says div by 0. Here it's giving this error, but that's because I've already told it to calculate the average in that cell. And since there are no values here, it's not actually, it can't divide. So it also allows us to calculate standard deviation. Now, again, I'm going to show my age here, but I am of the era where I actually, at the, before students had access to computers in schools, we were calculating standard deviation by hand. I mean, with a calculator, of course, but, plugging in all the numbers rather than just typing equals STDEV, right? So teaching them how to use, and of course they've done some programming of Excel or of Google Sheets in physics if they take patterns physics. So I have chosen to save time by having them use the resources rather than do all the calculating, because I find that very time consuming. And I also tell them, if you can tell your future employers that you know how to calculate with Google Sheets, then that's a huge advantage for you. Now, the mathematical models that they get in this lab are relatively simple. They're either proportional or proportional with a limit. They do have this interesting, 0, 0, 0 down at the bottom because it does take a while for the leaf discs to actually start to float. So the way that we usually do it is that we, have them maybe calculate two slopes, like one here at the bottom and then one before it tops out.
And I was reading somewhere that, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it takes about 4 class periods.
Yeah, so I was reading a thing where it talks about the 50% value being very important for sort of synchronizing all of your labs together. So it's kind of about procedure. So you can kind of know where kids are on this based on when 50% of them, in this case 5, have reached the top.
Okay, any questions about the lab? So you can either do it with the virtual option or the floating leaf one. If you're doing the virtual option, it's a lot shorter, right? Because they don't actually have the data collection is very quick. I will say that there are some limits, though, to the way that code is written. It doesn't actually, we know as biologists that there's going to be a top out when there's not enough carbon dioxide in the leaves. But the simulation doesn't actually show that. So if you want to, if you know that you have students who perhaps are struggling a little bit more with the application of the mathematics to the biological principles, then maybe the virtual option is a good one for you, because then you can still have them doing the data collection, doing the graphing, but the patterns that they're getting, the mathematical patterns, are a little bit simpler. Now I pointed out here, or I didn't point it out, but I'm pointing it out now, that if you've been involved with Patterns for a while, you know that we have offered Desmos templates for students to fill in each time. And I called this one the regular Desmos template, and it looks something like this, where they have some instructions about what to do, how to fill out their everything they have to fill out to get a graph to appear. But there's also an opportunity. I'm trying to get into it more and more to use something called Desmos Classroom. It used to be called Teacher Desmos. And I wanted to show you why that is an advantage. This is an actual screenshot of my class results from the photosynthesis inquiry 2 years ago. So this is using the virtual option. But what I love about Desmos Classroom is another accountability thing. I can see every student's graph, and they can only what shows up for me is what shows up if they have logged into their account. So they cannot just copy somebody else's graph and paste it into their lab report, as we all know that happens all the time. Or does it? I don't know. Never, right? So I love this because now there are some limitations. The screenshots aren't as good, and it's a little bit harder to see sometimes, but I know what I'm looking for, and I can always log into my own Teacher Desmos account to find out what it is that students have actually graphed if I need to see their graph in more detail. So it's great. You can reorganize the graph, so you can put all the ones that have done the same variable together. They can compare their results with each other. You can determine relatively quickly if students have followed the suggested error bar values and things like that. And so I really encourage you to play around with it. Maybe that's your project for the summer. Bradford Hill does I have done with him a Teacher Desmos in biology, or I think we called it Desmos Classroom in biology. But he also does like just a basics on Teacher Desmos. He goes into super detail. I don't use, I'm sure, 1/10 of the capabilities, but this one for me has been really great because I know that I can tell who really knows how to use Desmos and who doesn't. And so I've really been shifting all of my wet lab graphing to this system. All right. So I'd like to hear something from you. Do we teach how to graph in Sheets? That's a good question. I do have we have a couple of tasks that do use Sheets. Certainly in this photosynthesis task, if they're testing the color of the light, they can't graph in Desmos, or I don't know how to do bar graphing in Desmos. So I give those students instructions about how to graph in Sheets. There is also a Sheets graph in the evolution unit for rock pocket mice. But in that one, I'm going to be honest and say I take a shortcut. I give them a self-graphing spreadsheet just to save time. So there are points in time, Megan, where that comes up. I wouldn't say I have a like step-by-step graphing tutorials about how to graph in Sheets. I figured that may come, hopefully will come in time for them. In my mind, I'd like to make sure that I focus more on the analysis and the reading of the graph, rather than something that they can look up on YouTube when they need it later. So it's a kind of it's a trade-off decision for me.
Yeah, we transferred over to Google Sheets pretty much for anytime it's a linear graph. And so because it does a pretty good job of showing that. So once we know that it's going to be a linear graph, because we usually use Desmos to kind of show the differences between the graphs, and it doesn't do that very well like Google Sheets. But I was going to ask you on the one that you did for you just showed us a spreadsheet not too long ago, Charlotte. Was that one, did it have a graph component attached?
No, I actually have them take the data from there and put it in Desmos.
Gotcha.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to drop a link in the chat. And if you still have the idea capture tool open, I'm just linking you back to that. What I'd like to know from you now, and again, some of you I know because I've met you in person. Some of you I know have taken a bunch of webinars before. Some of you have taken the summer class either in person or virtually. But I'd like to get now that we're kind of at the end of the year, if you've done patterns inquiry tasks, I want you to reflect on one or perhaps more, if you wish, of the following questions. And I put them right into the idea. The questions are in the idea capture tool also. So I'm asking actually, it should be for those of you who have experienced this approach as a teacher, that's the preview to the beginning of all the questions. So first, what differences do you see in the student experience? If you feel that you want to remark about that, you can maybe write an answer and highlight it in yellow. You can't really type it in yellow. I didn't do a good job with my color picking. Secondly, how does this approach allow students to leverage their own knowledge while collaborating? Then when teaching using inquiry, what are the trade-offs? And I wanted to particularly point out that this is particularly significant coming out of the pandemic, right? We definitely have trade-offs that we have to keep in mind. And then lastly, why do we need to make these experiences worth it for our teaching and for our students' experiences? So if you could each pick one of those questions and write an answer in the appropriate color so we know which one you answered in that idea capture tool. You might still have it open, or I did just put that link in the chat. And we'll give you a few, it's just after 5, so we'll give you about 3 minutes maybe to answer. And as a side note, if you have finished your own answer and something resonates with you that someone else has written, everybody's going to show up as anonymous, unfortunately, but I think that you can still put in a comment if you'd like to add a comment onto the side, or, hit a couple of hard returns and then add a comment down below if you're so inclined.
It's a lot of orange and blue. From art class, what were those called when they're not complementary colors, but they're the opposite? That's what orange and blue are. I remember that.
So this is lots of people typing, so I'm going to give another minute or so. I'm going to drop that link into the chat one more time. I think we just had someone join us back, might have gotten cut off of the meeting. Does anybody have anything that they want to verbalize? There's some really great ideas there. A lot of themes, the trade-off around big trade-off around time, skills being important, real tough when we have attendance concerns. Yeah. I appreciate you all engaging in that. I think that it's nice to have those reflections in our in our permanent record. Anybody have any burning thoughts that they want to share beyond what they typed? Okay, I'll just wrap up real quickly on that inquiry with just a couple of examples of what the graphs might look like. So you can see here that Sheets graph for the colors. This group, this group actually colored their bars to coordinate. And then I did also, in response again to some requests in previous webinars, try to put a medium and a high example written by students so that you can see those. And I think, and these should be, they should be accessible to everyone because they should be in the restricted access folder. And then I'm gonna, after this, I'll wrap up on this and let Jason take over on the next section. But those of you who've been around a while might be wondering what happened to the algae engineering project. With the shift in requiring us in Oregon to teach the tribal history, shared history lessons, we had to shift the unit phenomenon over to our fire phenomenon. And so that really meant that our algae project, where the focus was renewable fuels, which tied in, of course, with climate change, but it did not tie in with fire so much. So if you teach IBESS or if you teach AP Environmental Science, we'd love to see that algae project implemented in other classes. So if you're interested and don't know, we're not around earlier on in the patterns history, then happily we can share some of those details with you. And if you're local, some of us may even have materials that you could borrow. We're trying to figure out a way to turn that into a patterns inquiry that could be used at some other spot, or we have a lot of students who use the basis for that algae project for their IAs in IB Bio. But if you're passionate about teaching students how to grow algae and to use a renewable fuels type of theme, then let us know, because we'd love to chat with you about how we might be able to get it back into the curriculum somehow.
All right. 6.3. So what we're looking at here is a graph, and it's another sort of simulation that the students are going to click on. This particular graph is showing the effect of oxygen on what it's basically showing oxygen. And so each of these, you can kind of see there's a little GIF here, has an environmental and a life component on the right side that tells you what new organisms are coming into play, and they're showing up at certain times. So what you see at the bottom is it goes from 3.8 billion years ago to present day. And so I found super interesting that there is a point where in 5 it gets to 35%. So if you know anything about oxygen rates right now are around 21%. They are dropping slightly with global warming, but it's not too severe as of yet. But at one point it was at 35%. And during that 35%, you had all kinds of really ginormous insects and other things. And so the kids get to sort of see that as they go through this particular task. Will you go ahead and click on the next one?
Yeah, you may notice there, I'll switch it over, but we also said that if you're looking for things that you might need to make some choices. This might be one that might not be the major emphasis if you're looking for a way to get to Unit 6, but don't necessarily have time to do it all. This is an HHMI biointeractive task.
And so the task is there. It's engage, right? So it's engage in HHMI. That's the particular one that they do. Will you click on that real quick? Or is this the website? This is the website. But the way that I would do it is I would split the kids again into particular groups based on the 2, 3, 4, 5, and I think it's just 2, 3, 4, and 5. So put kids in groups of 4. 1 and 6 have already been done for them in the particular activity. And so they are looking at a couple of things. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see exactly what they're looking for. And so that's the little box that they're going to fill out. And so each group of 4 is going to have these pieces. So everything in red is stuff that's been written in. So the kids are going to fill that stuff in. So they're looking at the graph, they're figuring out where the starting oxygen levels were, where the ending ones are. And there are 2 different ones. And that's because there are actually 2 graphs. It's kind of the high and the low. And then you can see what did the percent oxygen change, or why did it change. You can see it's because of those bacteria that had this ability to have a plastid to create that oxygen from the sunlight. And then what new life forms, you can see there were a couple of them that were already here. The anaerobes and the cyanobacteria were already there, but the eukaryotes, which obviously is what we are starting to be there. But these are single-celled creatures. They are pretty simple. This is only stage 2, which goes from 2.4 to 1.8 billion years ago. And then it says, how did the different organisms adapt to the change? You can kind of see that they are pretty simple at this point because the oxygen is so low. And then we can kind of go through to the next one.
You have them do some kind of data discussion so that they are all able to fill in all the sections, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
And then
those of you
after
who
the,
have taught,
go
if
ahead.
you've taught other patterns courses, you might, the idea of the data discussion isn't always about a mathematical pattern and a lab, right? The whole many activities that we do are based on the idea of a jigsaw, so that each student group does a small thing and then they share together, either in a rotating jigsaw or a variety of different ways you can do it, where all the rest of the students are able to gather the information without having to do every single part of the task. It reduces the cognitive load.
And then when they've had their conversation with each other about what part they chose to do or that you assign them to do, they use this thing called the stronger and clearer protocol. It kind of reminds me of like a 4 corners activity where you're kind of increasing the rigor or the quality of your answer by putting it through sort of a telephone. This person tells it to this person and they add to it, and then they add to it again, and they end up with a very strong answer. And so you can kind of see it here. Here's the initial answer, and then they write down their partner's name, and they talk about ideas, evidence, and language from that person, and then they go to the next person, and then they kind of just keep making it, as it's called, stronger and clearer until they get a very strong answer at the end. I think they go through 3 times in this particular lab.
Yeah, I love Stronger and Clearer. The only downside is that it takes a long time. I use it, I often end up skipping this task, but I've used Stronger and Clearer in other areas. So it's a nice writing strategy where it's okay for students to borrow ideas, but then they have to take those ideas and write them in their own words.
It also gets us back to the claim evidence reasoning thing. And I thought it was so cute that I can't remember his name, but the name of the little lizard, Charlotte probably knows. What's the lizard's name? But anyway, when you click on the lizard, it tells you the evidence that supports the claim that they're making. So it was like, click on the lizard. The lizard will tell you. He doesn't actually tell you, but there's documentation that shows you. All right.
I can't remember his name. I just tried to search for it. I can't find it.
It's in the lab. Howie. Thank you, Kim. Isn't that their mascot, right? Isn't Howie their mascot?
Yeah. I mean, you
entire
can
thing?
see him. He's there he's right here.
Yeah. Howie. So then, am I doing this one?
You can, yeah.
So this is our tribal history, shared history lesson. This particular one is talking more about some of the tribe. What's the word I'm looking for? We basically had these treaties with these tribes, and these tribes were on their particular land, and they get moved off of their land, and sort of the implications of all of that. So like who owns it and who gets to manage that land is represented in these particular tasks. And as Charlotte mentioned earlier, all of these are written by tribal leaders, and the ODE comes together to create these lessons. And so they are, by law, things that we are supposed to be teaching. And we're not usually going to take anything out of these lessons. I feel you can always kind of add a couple things in there to maybe give some clarity, but definitely don't like start removing a whole bunch of slides. And if you do get to anything in 6 point, in unit 6, this would be the thing that you'd want to hit. And so there is, you can see the reason why we do these, and then the lesson itself is going to be there right on that website. But I think on the next slide, it has the actual link to the thing.
Yeah, we've also worked with we have worked to enhance these lessons, not to change them. We have not changed the content of the original lessons, but we have added biological context where we have felt that it's appropriate, and we have had these modifications reviewed by not the same tribal leaders who wrote them initially, but by other tribal members who are involved in education. So any changes or differences that you see between what is on the patterns in the patterns folders and what is on the ODE website is done in good faith and with and to enhance rather than to detract from the initial lessons that we're expected to teach, as part of being teachers in Oregon. So this lesson has two components. It does take I find that it takes about 2 days, 2 block periods to do it. The first set or the first part is where students actually are watching several videos from Native Voices, talking about their stories, and specifically about Manifest Destiny and how the movement of colonizing groups came and took resources away from tribes. There's a whole interview done with a person about the rights that were, you know, officially signed by treaties and then immediately taken away, you know, that the treaties were reneged upon, and then how some tribes have really clawed back their rights to more space, and to the access to money to restore some ecosystems. And then there's a second set of videos that talks about, or where the native voices are instructing students about how traditional indigenous knowledge is different from Western science. So I have, you know, this is where I sprinkle in a lot of Robin Wall Kemmerer braiding sweetgrass type of information, you know, that's along the same lines. That's an enhancement that I've chosen to make. So that's the first part. And so students have an opportunity to reflect on maybe on those ideas and how maybe they learned about some of those historical things in history class, but never really thought about the effects on the ecosystems, for example. And then the second component of this lesson is about how tribes in Oregon have partnered with local groups in their area. Sometimes it's public-private partnerships. Sometimes it's tribal interactions with the U.S. Forest Service or the Department of the Interior through the BLM. And our enhancement here is that we have jigsawed the work so that, again, each group does one partnership and works on gathering the details about a single partnership. There's a shared slideshow where each student group will work on a slide. There's my little message to teachers. But so they, you know, work together in their group to answer the questions and incorporate the information that they learned about their particular partnership. So we're working on pulling evidence from text and then interpreting what that means, and then talking about why that thing matters. So one example, let's see if I can find it. I think it's which one is it? So let's, can't remember. One of these partnerships is where they've actually worked together to repurchase an area of land that had been taken. And so they're working to reforest and make that back into native, the similar kinds of flora and fauna that were there before. So that's the second part. They identify these goals and what the impacts are on the tribe. So I would say that the first part with some introduction, takes maybe a little bit less than a full class period. And then the one where they're actually working with their group and then doing some sharing, that does take a full block period. And then down there at the bottom, it kind of fell off the edge of my slide, but in the INB, there's a way for them to actually track their learning at the end of each lesson. And so I definitely make sure to spend some of that, since it doesn't quite take the whole time period the first day, make sure that they're filling in that tracker as they go. And that leaves them a record of all of the things that they learned in each section of the unit. And then they can always go back to that as an overview. And of course, this is related to cultural responsiveness because we're all from different parts of Oregon. And I saw we even have a participant today who is not in Oregon at all, but on the East Coast. It would be interesting to find out what the tribes that were historically present in your own location, right? And that has to do with knowing your students. You may not know if your students are native. I know one year I had a student who came and told me at the end of the year, thank you so much for talking about these issues, because I've never had a teacher who's talked about native concerns before. Well, and I learned a lot too, having to learn these teach these tribal history lessons. So of course, in the Willamette Valley, we're in the area where the Kalapuya historically were present, but it's important to know what was happening in your local area, right? And tie it back with the tribal history, shared history lessons from earlier in the year, seasonal rounds and so on. Any questions about tribal history, shared history, or the implementation? I'm curious, last year when we did this webinar, some people had not been told that they were needing to do tribal history, shared history. If you're in a school where tribal history, shared history has not been discussed, you might want to ask. Because officially, I think this is the third or fourth year that the expectation is there. If you're in a public school in Oregon, that the expectation has been there. I think this is the fourth, maybe the fourth year. All right, so that leaves us a fair bit of time to talk about kind of the biggest task of this unit. So Jason, why don't you start and I'll jump in a little later.
Yeah, so this is why I was thinking that it kind of links together, because we are discussing some of the more tribal issues with forest management and fires in general and indigenous fire management. So there's a couple of videos here, and I think we might watch a piece of one here in a second. And it kind of, again, it bookends, right? So right at the beginning of the unit in 6.1, we talked about fires in Oregon and the 2020 fire and all of that. And now we're ending with fire again. So I really like how that sort of, culminates. But the phenomena is when forests are actively and responsibly managed, forest fire risk can be reduced and the forest biomass diversity can be improved. We like to think that when we came in, we fixed everything, but really in some cases we didn't. We made it worse. And so there is some evidence of that, and we get to hear from more Native voices that discuss that in this particular test set. Will you click on the next one? And so this is the forest management practices student template. And so if you click on that, again, we can see Charlotte's comments on the side. That's how we write to each other. It's very nice. Like we have all these little things where we write to each other. As you kind of go through, you can see in the table of contents kind of the things that we're going to be hitting throughout. And you probably notice that we have those at the beginning of all of our lessons, just so that you can kind of get back and they lead you right to that place. So as Charlotte was talking about earlier, there are multiple entry points that you can kind of come in, and those bookmarks do a nice job of kind of saying, well, you're doing this piece and not this piece, and so on and so forth. Request for evaluation. So they're creating, they're putting their school, and you can kind of see how that all works there. And then there's the cultural burning, which is the video that I just mentioned we were going to watch a piece of. The real video is about 18 minutes long. I shrunk it down using Edpuzzle to be about 4 minutes, just so we can kind of see that. Obviously, you would watch the whole video with your class.
So just a side note, the way that this task is structured is that the end product is some kind of written document.
Yep.
The way that the request for proposal is set up, and it's set up in that similar way that many engineering projects in patterns courses are set up, where this real world situation is put at students, and we're trying to mirror what an actual engineering firm would receive as a request for a proposal, or a request for, in this case, what did we call it? I'm now lost my train of thought. Oh, request for evaluation. where we're asking students to evaluate the current practices and to make a proposal for what practices they think should either A, be continued, B, be totally changed, or C, some combination of historic practices and new practices. And so I often, the last 3 years that I've done this task, have taken this in as the last assessment of the year. Last assessment of the year. And so for me, this is like the final opportunity that they have for a grade. And this year, I had a lot of problems with plagiarism last year. And so I'm thinking actually that this year I'm going to let them come in on the very last day and come in with whatever notes they want, handwritten notes or printed out printouts or highlights or whatever. And I think I'm going to have them do an on-demand writing or an on-demand poster or something that they can do in that last 90-minute finals period, where I'm going to hopefully avoid the plagiarism piece.
So this is your final, Charlotte?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking about doing this year. But in the past, it's just been the last task, and the culminating task has been, the final, but it's not a comprehensive final. It's just the last opportunity for an assessment. So, but I'm thinking about doing it in that on-demand way this year, because I lost a lot of time last spring dealing with plagiarism stuff at the very, very end, and I really want to avoid that this time. Caitlin, I'm wondering, actually, are you talking about your about this forest management thing or about the tribal history, shared history one?
I'm talking about the assessment task of coming up with a suggestion for future forest management stuff. So it's exciting to see some new stuff to inject into that project.
Yeah, great, cool, thanks. Yeah, and Megan, I'm really glad that you're noticing that we really tried. We felt that there were a few things missing, pedagogically from some of those lessons that were developed with ODE and the tribes. So really the modifications were made in the spirit of making sure that all students have access to that knowledge. So what we're going to do here is that we're going to, like Jason said, in this slideshow, I've actually given you all 3 clips that I show to students. But what we are going to do here is that we're going to just watch, Jason, like he said, condensed it down into the real essentials in 4 minutes in Edpuzzle. So I think that I have, let me just check. I may have to check my sharing options. I think I set that up properly. I'm going to play it, and then you guys are going to I'm sure you'll tell me right away if you can't hear the music or hear it. And I may have to stop my sharing and start again. So this comes from KCET, which is public television in California. And they did a whole series called Tending the Wild. And I think it's like 4 one-hour episodes. I really encourage you to watch it. This one happens to be all about cultural burning. And we don't show the whole thing, but several clips. But what we're going to see right now is a condensed version. Tell me if you can't hear it.
I cannot hear it.
Okay.
You have to.
You can
No,
or
I can't.
cannot.
I think I just heard it a second ago, maybe.
Okay. All right. I'm going to turn off my video because that will help.
Know how to work with fire. When you're my age, I take my young ones out. Smell the smoke. Smell it. That's grass fire. Smell the smoke. That's a house burning. Smell the smoke. That's tires burning. That's a wood fireplace burning. You should be able to smell every single different kind of smoke. The animals teach their young to do that. But if there's no fire, they can't teach them to do that. In this particular area, This is where we've been burning for the past 5, 6 years. We've applied fire here a couple of times. This is the Mariposa gray leaf manzanita. This is a medicine, both food and medicine. The berry could be, once it's fermented, a really good drink for your stomach. One of the things that we've done here is we burned underneath this and pruned this bush up, trimmed it up so that one, it will have these nice big bunches of berries. And then on the stalk here, the bark is peeling. This bark is used for poison oak. When you're burning, you try to get the wind to go in the direction of the resource that you want to apply smoke to. Smoke helps the leaves and the berries to become a better product. Consequently, there's been new growth. That's all a part of the end result of applying fire and smoke to the resource.
Fire is really a lot like electricity. Electricity is a dangerous thing. You can get a severe shock from electricity and it can kill people, but it can also be put to wonderful uses. And fire, when used in a sophisticated manner, is very much the same way. Fire can force through the forest like electrons through a wire and energize those circuits that the forest has. It can turn on the meadows and encourage them to bloom at the right time of the year.
Fire is a spirit. This land has spirits. And when we're burning, they come alive. And those spirits, they still here. That's why we do sing to them. That's why we do talk to them. You have to understand fire. You have to respect fire. You can't be afraid of it. If you're afraid of fire, you won't understand fire.
See.
Fire is going to be on land, whether we like it or not. We can either choose when and where and how we prepare for it and how to deal with it, or continue on its fire suppression and hope belly that it don't come back, but it eventually will. And the problem is it becomes these high intensity super fires that cause nothing but damage. There's no benefit to it. I'm doing some shell sorting, the heavy fractions from flotation that we took in our tribal's traditional territory, finding even some fragments of fire-cracked rock, and getting a good number of all this for its relevance in our land tending uses in our territory. With cultural burns, you not only are removing those fuel loads that create those super fires, but you're healing the earth. When you wait for those big super fires, those wildfires, they destroy the soil, they bake the soil, it sterilizes it, kills a lot of the fire dependent and non-fire dependent seeds in the seed bank. It gets to a level of intensity where people can't stop it or suppress it anymore. Having prescribed burns, cultural burns, is something that we all realize, at least with experience on the land, that is something that needs to be done.
So again, Jason just cut that down, but you get the spirit of several different clips there, right? So the second person who was talking about fire being like electrons, that person is a Forest Service employee who works with tribes to help transition towards some cultural type burning or prescribed burns, as it's known outside of the tribal communities. But with students, I would show the little bit longer clips, and I'm actually thinking that I may this year try to do either. We don't have a district subscription to Edpuzzle, so I'm not sure, Jason, you'll have to tell me more about how that works, but making sure that students are able to pull more quotes from the movie or from the film here, rather than just from the text or other kinds of resources that we're that we've provided to them. So I always get really inspired when I watch this particular series, and I think I may take part of this weekend to watch the whole series again. It's really quite well done, I think, on a variety of levels. So that process, or that video, is actually just part of this part one, learning the history and the science of tribal forest management. And the students in their template have access to some prompting about where they can start to collect evidence about why it's important to tribes that they do these cultural burns, and why it's able why it's potentially a good thing for the forests as well. The second part then goes into what's called the historical shifts in the forest management practices. And in that section, I'm actually just going to jump back over to the student template so that you can see that part. So you can see here, kind of at the bottom of my shared screen here, where they've marked, they have a place to mark what tribal forest management practices are in place and what the impacts are. So this might be where they would put something like, they burn in a small area in order for the manzanita tree to give up some of its bark and to encourage the growth of plumper berries, which can be used for medicine. That would be an example. Whereas government or Forest Service practices would be suppressing fire in order to preserve the quote unquote pristine landscape that has existed in the West. And then we provide them also with a bunch of different kinds of articles that we have vetted. This is one of the ways that I find that we're able to make sure that students are getting the right type of information. Not that we're pushing them towards one line of thinking only, but I find students sometimes get paralyzed, especially when science is maybe not their thing. Sometimes they feel like they're not sure if a resource is good, or they don't know how to go about searching for a resource that gets them some information that they could use in a task like this. So, and again, when we wrote this, we were writing it during the year that we were in CDL. So we felt that it was important for us to provide resources to students so that we could be sure that we were giving them plenty of things that they could look at if they wanted, if they were engaging that year. So they're prompted to fill in based on their reading. They certainly don't read them all. This is another one of those jigsaw situations where I kind of control how many students are reading each resource so that we don't get, 38 students reading the same article. And they have a wide variety of topics. So then you'll see part 2 is quite short, but it covers 2 things. There are, or 2 documents, 2 resources that come from the National Park Service and also from the National Forest Service about how the approach to fire has shifted over the years. Now, these are longer. The timeline is actually quite simple, or it's single page. There's an interactive one also. Then they have this Forest Service brief history, and then this evolution of wildland fire use. Those are a little bit longer, so I try to strategically guide some students who I know might be faster readers to work on the longer pieces, and then they're able at their table to share out verbally and get the gist of each component, or reference to each, I shouldn't say each component, each different article or resource that they have access to. Then part 3, which kind of goes on the same, I'd say part 1 probably takes 1 day. Parts 2 and 3 are really, they can kind of go together. Part 2, as you can see, is relatively short. And then in part 3, there is like a quote and then a podcast that some students are listening to. And then they have some notes prompts for part 3, and then small group discussions. So those 2 things go together. And then lastly, and this is the part that I pick up for my last assessment, is where the students are developing an argument. And the way that it's set up here in this template, again, is for an essay, but I think that this year I'm going to do a on-demand essay or some kind of on-demand, I don't think I'll do slides, want to do something off the computer, but something maybe on a poster. I haven't really figured that out yet, but I'm not sure that I want to have all the students write an essay at the end of the year this year. There's a resource sheet. They are making an argument, no matter what the product will be, they will be making an argument. And then they can use this guided graphic organizer to make sure that they have all of the different components of a good argument, with evidence and reasoning, of course, and then making a counterclaim and a rebuttal, and then a conclusion. So I may, if a student chooses to write an essay, in the on-demand, I might allow them to come with some notes written on here that I would check to make sure that they haven't like pre-written the essay or something like that. Now, of course, we want to make sure that they're citing their sources. So if you look at the rubric for this task, there's actually a component in the rubric that's set aside for scoring them on citations. This is something that I teach all year long, and come back and give students opportunities in lower stakes situations where they're not being graded on it, so that they do have enough experience and practice to do that when it actually counts as part of the grade. But you can certainly have students do, the final product in any one of a variety of ways, depending on what kind of product you want them to make at the end. Now, of course, this is culturally responsive, right? In the fact, certainly not only for our Indigenous students, but also just for all students, right? To know that we as teachers are thinking about some of the underlying things that have that really do impact all of us in our daily life now, in terms of thinking about the climate and climate justice and environmental justice and all these sorts of things. This is where we take the SEPs and the cross-cutting concepts and the DCIs, and then incorporate interest and identity. And I can't remember, I don't have a citation for this, but this comes from some educational research that indicates that when you take interest and identity and add it to the 3 dimensions, that actually provides a 5-dimensional learning experience that's really most impactful for students, right? And so we have that, we try to incorporate as much cultural responsiveness, which looks like all these things, right? Having caring relationships with your students is a component of being culturally responsive. Making sure that you're providing them opportunities to think about things that are relevant to them and that are place-based, and like taking action for social and environmental justice that I just mentioned. All those things are part of being culturally responsive. And I think that this task gives them an opportunity, or gives you an opportunity as the teacher, to hit on most, if not all, of those. Okay, I'm gonna skip over that question. So again, here I provided a couple of examples. I love it when students leave the colors in their final writing, because that helps me see as a teacher whether whether my categorization, I guess, of claim and evidence and reasoning is really translating to them. I really try to focus on the fact that evidence in science very often has numbers. So I want to make sure that they're incorporating numerical evidence whenever it's possible. And so you can see here's an example of that. A burn of 25 to 40% of the landscape is enough to minimize the escalation and expansion of wildfire. right? And then that student has gone on to describe what that means, that when a cultural burn or a prescribed burn has happened, then that's going to prevent the long-term effect or long-term possibility that wildfire can make it into that space. So we do have a medium example and a higher level example here for you to also look at your leisure. Zalak pointed out, sent me a private message saying that they're having their students do end of the unit sketch notes. So that's another opportunity that you could provide to students to do this with drawings and notes in a kind of a storyboard style of assessment rather than a writing. That's a great idea for this. I think that could work very well. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left. Jason, you want to go over the possible assessment options?
Yeah. So what you're seeing here is kind of where you grab I mean, we call them course outcomes. And so right now we've been going through this process of trying to take everything that we do in the patterns curriculum. And when I say we, I mean my particular district, and trying to boil it all down into course outcomes that can be tested by a kid, and then the kid can either meet that standard or not meet that standard. And then next year it's going to be in our synergy and all of that other kind of stuff. So I feel like I've been like jumping in and seeing all this stuff over and over and over again, which is great. But at the same time, it's here. And so you can see here, we got carbon cycle simulation. These are where the evidence for the student hitting those particular performance expectations exists. And we do this through the entire curriculum from the beginning of the year in September all the way until the end. And so you can kind of see exactly where we hit all of these particular pieces. One thing Charlotte didn't mention is we are audited by 2 different groups that look over our curriculum. One of them is an equity audit where it looks and makes sure that we are not leaving anybody out, that we're representing everybody, that we are not saying anything that's going to trigger anybody. And then the second one is on the NGSS performance standards to see that everything is being touched on that we are responsible for. I mean, you probably know that biology has, like 20 some standards. And then when you include those earth science ones, it's even more than that. So trying to get all of these covered is really important to us. And we are seeing that we pretty much have hit the mark on all of it. But, every so often we're like, are we covering that? And then we get together and we sort of put it together. But yeah, these are all of our assessment options.
So we also provided to hear some other supports. Some of them we talked about before. There was a link, I think, earlier on to the student version of the Unit 6 INB. This is, I mentioned it I think it was when we were typing a little bit earlier. I actually put my copy of the INB on my Canvas for students to see. I don't advertise it for everyone. I don't want I don't want them copying my INB, but if they're absent, it's helpful to be able to point them at least in the direction of those. And I keep that from year to year, but I do revisions to kind of make things hopefully more concise and less wordy. I tend to be relatively wordy. So then there's some unit rubrics. These come from BSD originally, from Beaverton. We're actually in the process of revising our unit level rubrics. But that's just an example for you to see. And then this is actually really old. I meant to eliminate it, but it is the Canvas shell from our Unit 6. This is wrong. Unit 6. That's just the Unit 6. Ecology should be, or matter and energy. But that is from CDL, so it's from a while ago. So if you want to look at that, you're welcome to look at it, but I think I'm going to toss it. But you can get rid of, you could find it in the Canvas Commons if you wanted to. So we have about 5 minutes left. We wanted to open up the floor to any questions, verbally or in the chat. And then we also would like to ask you to answer our exit ticket. And the reason that we need you to do that is because it's actually part of the grant that helps pay you to be here. I'm going to copy this link and put it into the chat. We do take your feedback into account. Mentioned a couple of times today, things that have come through from feedback are wanting to know about, making sure that we're providing student examples wherever it's possible, and also making sure that people have an idea about timing on certain tasks. Those are two things that came both out of the feedback. So we appreciate any feedback you will give. And it also helps us fulfill the requirements of the grant.
Yeah, and that second bullet point I think is super important too. If there's any time, especially if you're in the middle of Unit 6, you're like, I have no idea what they said. There is a video, you can watch it, but it's, send us an email. We will send you back. I know Charlotte and I are very quick responders. Usually, at least I am most of the time. So send us an email. We'll get back to you. And if, something we said that you're like, I think it would be better if you did it this way. We like those emails too. So
Yeah.
let us know.
Agreed.
We're just teachers like you that are trying to do as best we can.
You're welcome. Once you finish that exit survey, you're welcome to go a couple minutes early if you wish, but we'll also hang out a couple minutes if anybody has questions.